people who are traumatized have deeply disturbing sensations and emotions and pictures, images. And when I started to work with people, and this was in the late 1960s and 1970s, I was surprised at how many different kinds of events could cause trauma. Things you wouldn't think about, like being in a car accident or having an operation, particularly with children, young children. But I also discovered that although there were many, many sources of trauma, that we really have an innate capacity to heal. And this capacity is based upon being able to encounter body experiences, internal experiences called introceptive awareness, that contradicted the feelings in trauma, which are of overwhelming helplessness, anxiety, fear, despair, and so forth. So it really was to be able to have new experiences. I was fortunate because when I started my work, the definition of trauma as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was still 15 years, 12 years in the future. So I didn't know that it was a incurable brain disease. So I was free to pursue my studies. And something occurred to me, because I kept coming back to the fact that so many different kinds of events, besides things like abuse and rape and war, of course, they have a very, very deep impact upon us. But that there were so many things that could cause people to become stuck in fear, to become stuck in collapsing and helplessness, that animals also experience similar threats, because their lives are threatened on an everyday basis. So if you're a rabbit, right, and going around, and then we have coyotes, well, you have foxes, and they maybe get chased, and they escape. And if they escape, then they can't be carrying on something like trauma, because if they become inhibited, if they become overly frightened, if they lose their ability to even come back, out into the world, they wouldn't survive, nor would the species survive. So I realized that in animals, there must be an innate capacity to heal from trauma. And as a result of that idea, I watched a lot of animal videos. I talked with wildlife people all over the world, and I compared this with them with some of the things that I was observing when people would, literally in a way, shake off the shock of the trauma, that their bodies would shake and tremble sometimes in a very gentle way, and they would have full spontaneous breaths, and their hands, which were cold before, became warm. And I talked to many of the people who worked in wildlife, and they said, actually, yes, we know, because if the animal doesn't do that, when we capture an animal and readmit them into the wild, then they won't survive. So again, this is something that has to be innate, because we share the same parts of the brain having to do with survival that all of the other mammals do. It's the brain stem, the upper brain stem, the cerebellum, the hypothalamus, the limbic system. We share this. It's almost identical. So if they're able to shake off trauma, then we also have that capacity. But we have to learn the language of how to speak to the person, how to guide them to have new experiences that are different than, that contradict those of overwhelming helplessness and fear. So in a way, it's very simple. But to do it, it's a little bit more complicated. But again, it's the idea of finding this language and helping people discover how they can get unstuck, how they can move back into life. I mean, indeed, that was the title of the book, right? In an unspoken voice. How the body releases, lets go of trauma, and restores feelings of goodness, of wholeness, of inner regulation. So my approach, when I started to develop in the 70s, really the whole idea of the body was completely foreign. It was all about the mind and behavior, changing behaviors or changing thoughts. But with trauma, it's so much deeper than that. It just doesn't work for trauma. I mean, it may help a little bit, but it really doesn't get to the fundamental stuckness, as it were. I can give you an example of a clinical application which is very simple, and you can practice it. All of you can practice. Very, very simple. And I can explain to you about the vagus nerve and so forth, but let me first just introduce you to the exercise. So the idea is to take a full, easy breath. And then as you exhale, you make a sound like voo, and you vibrate it as though it's coming from the belly, from the gut, from the viscera. And you just let all the air out, and then just let the breath come in on its own. And again, to repeat the voo. And you're welcome to join if you like, all of you. And it seems simple, and it is, but just notice what has shifted in your body, what you're noticing now, what kinds of sensations. Do you feel tingling? Do you feel vibration? Do you feel warmth? Do you feel coldness? Do you feel coolness? Do you feel sensations like of tingling or vibration? And then those sensations change. You see, because if we go to deal with trauma right like this, it doesn't work. It just like, well, there's, you know, the Greek myth of Medusa. When anybody looked into her eyes, they were frozen, exactly. And she had all of these snakes, and her eyes were like this. And, you know, so she just got everybody frozen. And so this was, again, a difficult situation. So they sent Perseus to deal with her, to slay her. And he sought counsel of Athena before he went. And Athena said, whatever you do, Perseus, do not look into her eyes. So I think he probably is thinking, okay, I have the idea. She says for me to do it, I do it. But how do I slay her without looking at her? So he had the idea of using his shield as a mirror. So he saw the reflection of her face, but not directly her eyes. And doing that, he was able to slay her, cutting off her head. But he didn't confront her directly, you see, and this is the important lesson from this myth, is we have to work with the reflection, and the reflection really is in the body. The myth of Perseus goes on because after he cut her head off, and she's bleeding there on the ground, of course that's never the ending of a Greek myth, right? Because that's the beginning. So two mythical entities come from where the wound was. One was Creosaur, whose name is the warrior with the golden sword, and the other one was Pegasus, the winged horse. So in a way, the horse is the image, the symbol of instinct of the body, and then the wings are that lead to transformation. So transformation through the bodily instincts. At least that's how I interpret the myth. I don't know, can't say exactly how it was meant originally. And then Creosaur is to be able to stay focused. Really, Golden Sword is about focus. It's about absolute truth, about going, in this case, beyond the trauma. So I think these two entities coming from her wound gives us, in a way, an image of how we transform traumatic experience. There's a natural reaction that takes us from the heightened state of arousal we experience when there's threat to bring us back down to equilibrium. And this is a sequence of physiological responses, often involving shaking, gentle shaking, trembling, as I mentioned, changes in temperature, all involving the autonomic nervous system. But you don't have to be traumatized, because we go through days, weeks of stress. We have things that happen in work, we have problems in relationship, we see somebody injured or something like that. And if people learn to be able to allow that shaking and trembling to happen, in a way you can say it discharges that state of arousal and brings the person back into balance. The exercise I did with the VU, that's really an interesting physiological response as well, because we have a nerve called the vagus nerve. It goes from the brain stem, to all of the organs, especially to the viscera, to our digestive organs. And when we are experiencing life threat, that system gets overactive. You know, when something really horrible happens, you have this twisting, horrible feeling in your gut. And that's, the vagus nerve does that. Now, 80%, maybe even more, of the vagus nerve is sensory. It's afferent. So in other words, it's impulses, sensory impulses coming from the viscera to go back to the brain. So it starts a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop with negative consequences, you see, because you have the gut-wrenching fear, then the signal from the viscera is the gut-wrenching sensation, which causes more fear, causes more contraction. So if you're able to break that loop, then the nervous system knows how to reset itself. And it does, and it will. The problem is we've become afraid of our own instinctual reactions. We, in a way, have become over-socialized. So we fear that which is involuntary. Probably the most only place that people experience something like this is women when they're giving birth, and sometimes in sexual climax. We feel that shaking and trembling and waves of heat and so forth. But it's a natural response to any buildup of stress or arousal. And I know people, you know, they say after work, before they go in the car, before they drive, they do some exercises, and then it's like the events of the day dissipate. One of the things I discovered was that trauma is a fact of life. It happens to everybody. It's almost certain that people will have at least a single traumatic experience in their life. So it is a fact of life. Trauma is a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence if we learn to listen to the healing dictates of the body.